All right, we're going to discuss audience analysis. Don't be confused if I have to exit the PowerPoint. The technology requires that I occasionally look at the time. I don't always do PowerPoints, but I think for things that are especially important, like audience analysis, which is kind of one of those fundamental skills that it's just instrumental to absolutely everything you do in public speaking. And this is also a skill that translates directly to things like conflict management, job interviews, writing cover letters or applications to colleges. Pretty much anytime that you have to address an audience or persuade them of something, this is a terrific tool. But it's not as simple as the book makes it out to be. So that's why I had you read sections of the book, but I think some of it can make it deceptively easy. So I'm going to take you through some of the key things about audience analysis, and I'm going to stop occasionally and give you a chance to think about how audience analysis works with your own topic. So there will be some built-in pauses to this presentation. Okay. The goals of audience analysis are that you need to be able to understand and describe various audience motivations. And by that we mean what type of audience are you addressing? Are you addressing a hostile audience? Are you addressing a motivated audience? Because obviously the attitude that your audience has toward you to start with should be your first concern, okay? Your audience is not a blank slate. You cannot talk to them as though you're talking to a wall or to an anonymous an anonymous listener. You have to address them as they are and where they are. And obviously, as we move through the semester, you want to think more and more as your topics become more challenging about what you need to do to get the audience on board with your idea. You also want to think about how the situation, time, and place affect your audience. In the case of this presentation, it's pretty simple. Number one, you have no idea when your audience is going to watch your speech, so you don't really know the time and the place. But the biggest thing for us to take into consideration is the technology. All of your classmates and I are going to be watching you via the internet, which means you have to talk extra slow. You have to make sure that your recording equipment is working correctly, that there's plenty of light. These are the big things in your case that impact your speech. Not so much whether it's the morning or the afternoon, although in the future, if you were giving presentations, you want to take those things into consideration. You want to be able to analyze your audience's perception of your credibility. That's pretty crucial. You need to sit down at the beginning of each speech and ask, what kind of credibility do I have in this speech? For instance, in this speech, people don't know a lot about you. You haven't established a lot of credibility, but at the same time, you're also not asking them to do much. A speech of introduction doesn't require them to accept a belief or a proposition. So your credibility doesn't need to be as high because there's no real investment. But at the same time, you always want to be practicing these skills. So even though the stakes for credibility are low, you want to start to put in moments where you establish your credibility. And we'll talk more about credibility later in the semester, but it's not just being an expert or, having a research background in something. It's also your goodwill toward the audience, whether you have passion for your topic, whether you're generally interested in having a dialogue with your audience and not just lecturing them. Those all factor into your credibility, and the more you practice these things early on, the more feedback I can give you, and the better off you are when they finally start to become real intense skills in the program. And then last, you want to think about your speech as building a relationship with your audience. You need to find moments in your speech where you're going to talk about we as a collective, or if you're not part of a collective, you want to express your interest in making this a dialogue. Now, by dialogue, we obviously don't mean that they're going to respond to you, like you'll ask a question and they'll answer. I mean, this isn't an audience response exercise because you're giving it to a computer screen. But that doesn't mean that you can't encourage them to participate or try to think of things from their perspective or do the kinds of things that show an audience that you're not just there to lecture them, but you're there to create a relationship and to offer them something of value in your speech and to get to a place where theoretically they would feel comfortable coming up to you after the talk and saying, hey, I disagreed with you about X, but I'd like to talk that out, okay? So you always want to think about your speech not as a one-way lecture, but as building an audience relationship, even if it's with someone you can't see. I mean, this is a skill that translates really well, I think, to when you have to write a cover letter for a job. I mean, you want to give the person on the other end of that a sense that they're in a dialogue with you. You want to give them a feel for what it would be like to meet you in person. You want that to come out from the letter. You don't just want it to be, a bunch of bullet points about some details about your life. That doesn't get them engaged, right? You want to engage your audience. Okay, and all of these goals obviously will be addressed in some way or another in the outline of speech 1, and they will continue to be goals throughout the semester because audience analysis underwrites everything you do. It affects every kind of speech we do. It affects all the canons of invention. I mean, your audience, that's what makes public speaking different from literature and from creating a website, is the fact that you have an audience right there, and this is the place where you really need to worry about analyzing your audience first. All right, so moving forward, when you analyze your audience, you want to think about balancing the speaker, the situation, and the audience. So obviously you're the speaker, you have an audience, and then there's the situation in which that you're in. And in this case, you are in a technological situation where people feel distant from you. So here's a question that I'd like you to think about. With that technological distance, what do you have to do maybe that a person in a face-to-face situation wouldn't need to do? Hopefully you just answered, be more attendant to building your credibility, be more attendant to drawing that audience connection, because you have to create it from further away. So the situation changes a little bit. Now, the key here is the balance. So you want you as a speaker, your credibility, your interests, your passions, to balance out with what the audience needs from you, which is value, a reinforcement of their sense of self, a sense of a relationship, and then a balance with the situation, because you obviously don't want to let the situation control what's going on. So in other words, you don't want to let the technology dictate too much how you do things, because if that were the case, you could just put a PowerPoint up and just say, here, watch this. So you want to balance your speaker, your audience, and your situation, and obviously all the time keeping the goal of the speech in focus. All right. So again, this is just a definition of the rhetorical triangle, but it's more of a device for thinking about your situation and not necessarily something that you'll need to know for future reference. But it does help you think about that sense of balance. Okay. Now, as far as audience motivations are concerned, for most of the speeches, I want you to think of your audience as an unmotivated audience, okay? So for the first and second speech, you will be talking to unmotivated audiences. For the third speech, they're still unmotivated, but the key is that when you revise the third speech for your revised persuasive speech, I'm going to make the audience hostile, okay? And then for the last speech, it's a little bit different. So I think unmotivated audiences are some of the hardest to persuade because there's a lack of a purposeful listening goal. They're not hostile to what you have to say, but they're not real excited about it either. I mean, the reason that you want to think about, I think, most audiences as unmotivated is that, yeah, they have to be there, right? Your fellow students have to watch you give your speech. The person reading your cover letter has to read it because that's their job, but they don't really have any real motivation to listen to you. So what does that mean? Think about that for a second. What does it mean for an unmotivated audience? What's different between them and a motivated audience? Part of what's different, if you look at motivated audiences who have a listening goal, is that you have to tell your audience what the goal is. Right? I'm here today to build a relationship with you so we can have a dialogue about X. And from that dialogue, I want to help you see my perspective, which is Y. So you have to be very clear up front, not necessarily in those terms. You want to be a little more subtle than that. But why people are listening to the speech in the first place, besides just you have to for your grade. Now, passive audiences are very similar to unmotivated audiences. They're made up of unmotivated listeners who are in the audience for a variety of reasons, but not because they want to hear a particular speaker or a particular topic. So, unmotivated or passive, those share a set of similarities, but the important thing is now not only for passive audiences do you have to give them a listening goal, right? They have to know why they're listening, but you also have to make you as a speaker and you as a topic interesting. Now, we don't really have passive audiences in our class because everyone who's an audience for you has to listen. The best way to think of a passive audience is if you were standing on a soapbox and you had to get a bunch of people to listen to your talk, how would you get those random people to stop and get tuned into your goal? Or if you had to, for instance, if you're at the mall, okay, and those people in the kiosks that try to sell you the hand cream or ask you if you want to, like, have your fingernails done, but they're trying to sell you a product, for them, you're the passive audience. You're in the audience for a variety of reasons. You're at the mall shopping or you're getting some ice cream or whatever, but you're not there to hear a particular speaker or listen about a particular topic. So not only do they have to motivate you to get on track with their goal, which is to sell you the product, they also have to get you, first of all, to recognize them as a speaker and to be interested in the topic, which is, skincare or whatever. So we don't really work with passive audiences in this class, but unmotivated audiences and passive audiences share a set of features. So you can think of both, but unmotivated typically are what I recommend you thinking of your audience as. Now, motivated audiences are obviously people that are there who have a goal, people who voluntarily attend church, people who go to rallies. Those people go there seeking a particular kind of reinforcement. They are the easiest of the audiences to persuade. So, I don't really teach that in this class because I think that's a skill that that you kind of pick up as you go. I think it's more important to think of your audience as unmotivated. And then homogeneous audiences all share a similar attitude, so they're a lot like motivated audiences. So for the last two, don't focus as much on them. The biggest audiences to understand for this class are unmotivated and passive for right now, because they're going to make up your audiences for the next three speeches. And then for the fourth audience, which is for your persuasive speech, revised persuasive speech, I'll teach you about hostile audiences, okay? So for right now, focus on unmotivated and passive. All right. So obviously, like audience analysis, right, which is one component of the rhetorical triangle, you've got your own credibility, assessing your own prior credibility. That's the speaker part of the triangle. And then you've got the situation aspect, okay? And you want to consider your time, consider the environment. And for us, this is key because the technological environment puts up particular barriers. Now, we talked earlier about the fact that one of the biggest barriers is the technology. And you'll see this as you listen to other people's speeches. And you've probably noticed it from the discussion board. They're very far away. You can't see them. You don't know a lot about them. The image of them in the video helps. Lots of things help. But really, they need to build a relationship with you before they need to do anything else so that you don't feel that technological distance as harshly as you might have otherwise. It's the same thing if you're ever going to write a cover letter. You need to think about how your language comes across in a letter or an email that's different from face-to-face, that's different from the telephone, that's different from a web chat. And, these are really advanced things to consider, and hopefully as the semester goes on, I can give you pointers. There's no real recipe for how to speak on the internet versus how to speak in person, but I think one of the biggest things to consider is that without that physical, proximity, you have to make up for the physical proximity with your words. And then obviously there are other considerations like just having good lighting, good video quality, making sure that you position yourself well, and slowing down your speech so that the people that are watching you can have time to process things. All right, and then so that was the situation, before that was the audience, and now we're back to you as the speaker. The concept of your perception is known as ethos. It's spelled E-T-H-O-S, and we will talk more about that in the future. Right now, I'm just trying to give you, basically planting the seed of ethos, right? I want you to just kind of start to think about ethos. An ethos is basically the audience's perception of you. Not you as a person. I mean, they don't get biographies. It's not like they know what sports you play and where you grew up and how many brothers and sisters you have. It's about how you come across in the speech. So if you come across as really preachy, they're going to have one perception of you. If you dress a certain way, they're going to have another perception of you. And some of this stuff isn't anything you can control. These are things that the audience brings with them when they meet you. So perceptions of northern accents, for instance. So these are all things you want to think about and try to mitigate in your speech. For instance, if you are giving a speech and you do have a very thick accent of some sort, try to enunciate words that might be very confusing or sound very murky when you say them. If you're a speed talker, which I am, you want to pay extra attention to slowing down. You want to think about what you wear. I don't require a formal dress code, but you don't want to wear anything too distracting. You want to think about maybe your age. If you're younger and you're giving a speech that requires a certain amount of wisdom and an age behind you, do you want to make up for that in some way in your speech by showing how your age gives you a particular kind of insight even though you're young? I mean, these are all questions you want to ask as you pick evidence and pick the style for your speech. Your prior credibility at this point is none. I mean, if it gets to be later in the semester and you maybe want to flip-flop on something, like you used to think one way about it, but after a lot of research you now think a different way, that's where prior credibility would come in, and at that point you'd maybe want to address that. But you don't need to do too much with your prior speeches in this class, because since they're all so different and they're different topics, they really aren't going to talk to each other too often. You really want to think about the fact that you're basically starting from scratch. And if you started each one of these speeches with a new audience from scratch who didn't know a lot about you, how would you build that relationship, right, using an audience analysis? One way is to demonstrate credibility in your speech. And again, credibility can mean two things. It can mean goodwill, or it can mean credibility in the sense of trustworthiness. So you can build credibility by borrowing authority from other sources. You can show how you've had experience in a subject. You can use a lot of statistics to make yourself sound very scientific. Or you can go the other way, or combine them and think about goodwill, showing that you want the audience to understand something, that you have a vested interest, that you're connected, and that you want to create a dialogue so that you as a group, you plus your audience, can come to an understanding about this. So you've got credibility and in the traditional sense, and you've got what we're going to call goodwill. And these are both part of ethos, and we will discuss ethos more and more because it becomes very important for your persuasive speeches. And then terminal credibility is in the book, so I thought I'd just address it very quickly. But it's essentially how your credibility is going to be impacted as you move forward. So it's the same thing as thinking about prior credibility. You want to think about future credibility as well. And this is just in general a good suggestion. If you're going to say something in your speech that's going to hurt your credibility in the future, you probably don't want to say it. So again, I think that terminal credibility is kind of built into credibility in general, but it is in the book, so I did want to kind of explain quickly what that meant. All right. Okay, now the big one, building audience relationships, right? You've got you got the situation, you got the message, and you've got your audience. And your job isn't just to give the audience a message like it's a FedEx package, right? That's impersonal. I mean, that's what we call the dissemination mode of speaking, where you just basically have a bunch of information and you want to get it across as quickly as possible. That's what I do when I teach, because I'm trying to give you as much information in a short period of time. I wish I had more time to build relationships with you. In a face-to-face classroom, we have more discussion. That's what the discussion board is in this class. That's the audience relationship component. So I'm sure as a student of online public speaking, you can see how our course suffers from the lack of relationship between me and you as a student. And for those of you who have sent me emails or have had video chats, you notice how much more comfortable you are in the course after that kind of interaction. So these audience relationships are really key, especially as you move into a persuasive speaking situation where you're not just asking them to listen, but you're asking them to think differently or take an action. So you want to, first of all, consider the existing values, beliefs, and attitudes. Your book suggests doing a demographic analysis. Audience analysis isn't a science. It's not like when you apply for a job, you're going to be able to go into the organization and take a survey of their age and their preferences and their religious beliefs and their ethnic background. I mean, in most cases, you're flying blind on this stuff. The best you can hope for is checking out the website. In this case, the best you can hope for is kind of just to think about what would a public, a group of college-age students, what kind of values would they share? But that's a really big category because you've got non-traditional students, students with children. So I think the biggest thing to think about is that you don't want to make assumptions unless you're sure they're going to be true for almost everybody. So if you're a parent, for instance, and you make the assumption everyone else, has children or cares a lot about children, what if you made the wrong assumption? And then your whole speech is anchored on this idea of, caring about children or caring about the future of children. And then it turns out people in the audience aren't thinking about that yet. Not that they don't care about kids, but that this isn't something that's present in their situation right now. These aren't concerns that are right at the forefront of their thinking. Then you've made a really big misstep because you've missed an opportunity to connect with your audience because you basically chose the wrong channel to connect to. So when you're trying to build on particular values and beliefs and trying to create that relationship around those values and beliefs and attitudes, try to pick things that are generalizable, things that are probably in common for everyone. For instance, everyone loves security. Everyone thinks that, probably personal relationship building is very important. Everyone wants to be successful in their career. I mean, these are general things that you can probably rely on, whereas something like loving the earth or thinking about the safety of animals, these aren't here and now concerns, right? And the further away you make the value, the further away your persuasion's going to be. So you want to try whenever possible to stick to things that matter in the here and now. Because yes, I agree that if we don't do something about global warming, in 20 years we're all going to be really, really sorry. But for a lot of people, 20 years is a really long time away. And so while they get it in their mind, it doesn't become a concern, right now in their it doesn't become a burning concern of theirs. So you want to try to stick as close as you can to the here and now. Okay. Teach, don't lecture, I think is really key. And the more kind of interactive things you can do, like bring in examples from maybe different lifestyles than yours so that you're trying to reach a broader audience. Taking things I like to call teaching moments, where you show them how maybe they thought one way about something, but now they should think differently because of a particular experience or a particular thing that you've imparted on them. You're not going to be able to do activities, but even little things like using the word we or us, which is called identification, those things can help. So, this is part of my job as my teacher to say, hey, you sound a little too lecture-y here. Try to fix that. So I'm going to give you some guidance on this, but this is probably my biggest complaint about students is they always take the lecture route. Try teaching or instructing or being, a partner in a dialogue and not just giving out information like it's a FedEx package. Okay, offer your audience something of value. This comes back to the values, beliefs, and attitudes. It's an important step for every speech. Even in your first speech, you're not going to fix any problems or give them any solutions or persuade them to believe something that's going to save the world, but you are trying to get them to know you. And rather than just say, hey, I'm a really good baseball player, or I have 4 kids, and talk about your kids, you want to give them something of value. What does knowing you help me know about myself, right? Maybe you had an experience with the death of a loved one and that's changed how you think about things. And you're sharing this experience because you want them to see how this experience can impact them even if they don't know what it's like. I mean, that's the something of value. When they leave, they should remember something about your speech that they can take away. And I don't mean a public speaking skill. I don't mean that in your speech you should teach them how to have good delivery. That's not what I mean by something of value. It's way more fundamental than that. Something of value being a human. This is one of the big things people fail to do in their speeches. It's a lot about the speaker. It's very speaker-centered, and they forget that there's an audience. But just because you value it doesn't mean that it's clear to the audience what it is that they're getting from your speech, other than just a little something about you, right? You want to go deeper than that. And this, of course, is related to the next thing. Balance your needs, which is your self-interest, your familiarity with the topic, your ability to deliver the speech, with their needs, which are something of value and something novel, right? You may want to give an introduction about how you have a kid sister and that kid sister has changed your life and you have a lot of stories that you know, but if you feel like this sounds like every other my kid sister has made me a better person speech, then you're probably going to wind up turning the audience off before you've even gotten started. So again, you want to stop and think, what is it that they can get out of this? Am I addressing their existing values, beliefs, and attitudes? And you should take some time right now and sit down and say, okay, here's my idea for my speech. Here's what I want to talk about. Here's what it says about me. Now, why does the audience care? I mean, that's the big question. So what? Yeah, it's information about you, but if they're going to forget it the minute you say it, you haven't added anything to their life. There's no payback for that 2 minutes that they just invested in your speech. And obviously, it'll be hard the first time around. The feedback from me will help tremendously, as it will from your peers. But start thinking about it from their perspective, not just from yours. You may think that, you probably think you're the most interesting person in the world. And you may love your stories, and your friends may all love your stories. But from a perfect stranger's point of view, I mean, are these things that are exceptionally interesting and useful and that speak to something about their life? Or is it just you getting up there and talking about you? Remember, that's not a relationship. That's a very one-sided way of looking at it. You want to think about it from both perspectives, okay? And then draw on common experiences. I mean, this is the key thing. If you have an experience that you think both of you have, you can explore that. But again, don't just say, hey, I play sports and I bet you like sports, so we have something in common. You don't want to take the cheap and easy route, but thinking about what you might have in common is really important. The other question is just if you've got something really cool about yourself or some really interesting experience, ask yourself this question. Even if someone hasn't had this experience, what experience might they have had that they can share in common with this? And when you think about those kinds of connections, you might realize that you don't have to have the same exact life experiences to learn similar lessons. Okay, and then this is something we'll talk about later, but I want to put it in your mind for right now. You want to spend extra time when attempting to shift perspective. So if you're trying to get them to think differently about something, okay, you have to shift them from A to B. So maybe you're going to tell a story about how your whole life you were career focused and then something happened and now you became family focused. You can't just say that. And then one day I woke up and all of a sudden I was family focused. Because life doesn't happen that way. You need to really spend some time and energy and language getting them involved in your old life, what it felt like to be career driven, why it was so important to you, how it consumed your life, and then you need to show how in that moment, whatever happened, the car accident or getting fired or creating a family, whatever it was, all of a sudden you started to realize things are different. That takes time and energy, okay? So whenever you have to do that and change someone's perspective or talk about your own change in perspective, you really need to spend some time. And this goes back to the old adage, show, don't tell, which I'm sure you've heard forever. Show them what happened. Don't just tell them what happened, okay? And then, obviously, make sure that they can follow you. And that obviously ties back into the previous point that you need to spend time on things that are complicated, which also leads you to composing a thematically coherent speech, because if you're going to spend time on things that are complicated, you can't talk about more than maybe one or two things. So you got to pick a central focus. You can bring in other things, but you don't have time then to also talk about the 5 other hobbies you have, right? You have to focus. And the best thing I can do at this point is to point you to the sample speeches that I've uploaded for your speech of introduction, because I think that they're not perfect, obviously, they're student samples, but I think that they do give you an idea about what it means to be thematically coherent. And this also is the other part of this reading for this week about narrowing your purpose and narrowing the theme of your speech, right? Because you is a big topic. Give me a speech of self-introduction. I mean, there's 100 ways you could go with that. It's better to do one thing well and use one thing to get across a central message than it is to spend the 2 minutes just giving them every single feature about your life, okay? This is not a biography and it's not a laundry list. It is a focused presentation of something about you that's important, that you share in common, that can also become of importance to your audience, A, for getting to know you, and B, for reconsidering their own life, okay? It's a big job. It's probably the hardest thing we do all semester is narrowing, because there's so much stuff to talk about. But if you don't narrow, you're going to, A, confuse your audience, and B, not have a well-composed speech. And the narrower you go, the easier your delivery will be, because you'll have fewer and fewer things you have to remember to say. You can just spend more time developing small parts. Okay, and that concludes our discussion of audience analysis. As usual, if you have any questions or you're having trouble translating the material into your speech, please feel free to email me and we will set up a time for an appointment or a video chat.